Prologue. Ready to go, Buster. If anyone can help me with this, it's going to be you. The dog by my side lifts his head to look at me. His tail moves from side to side on the ground, shifting pine needles out of the way. Behind us is our small tent where we spent the night, getting ready for today. Far off, past the trees and capped with snow, rises the rocky peak I aim to reach. There was a time when hiking up Snowdon would just be a normal thing for me. People from all over come to this part of Wales to make their way to the top. But today, it means so much more than just reaching the highest point in Wales. To me, it's a challenge that, until not too long ago, seemed out of reach. Honestly, without Buster, I wouldn't even be here. Let's go, I say, and we start walking. It's so early, we have the place to ourselves. The morning sun streaks through the trees, lighting up our path. Buster leads the way, sniffing around and then coming back to check on me. He keeps a close eye on me, as good dogs do. But there's something extra about this golden lab. No one gets me quite like Buster does, or feels the worry I carry as we go over a stile and start on the path that could either lift me up or break me down. On my own, I might just give up, head back, and pretend I saw the view from the top. But with Buster, I know that would just be lying to myself. I chose to start at this time for two reasons. At my pace, it's going to take us much longer to get to the top. Every step needs to be thought out, as I brace myself for a sharp pain that could stop me in my tracks. We're taking the pony track, the route most tourists use. By late morning, I expect this path, which starts to zig-zag up the lower sides of the mountain, to be busy with hikers. And that's the main reason I wanted to start early. I don't want anyone to see me but my dog. Right now, the last thing I want is for some energetic 75-year-old with a heavy backpack to pass me and wonder what's slowing down a seemingly healthy man in his 40s. The thing is, I might look okay on the outside, but every step is a challenge because a wrong move could cause a lot of pain. Relaxing is hard for me, but I never feel pressured by Buster to hurry. He quickened his pace, leash-free and cautiously scouting ahead as though ensuring our path is secure. Buster, unlike some dogs, doesn't dart away, lost in his own adventure, nor does he glue himself to my side, becoming a tripping hazard. His independence, yet companionship, is exactly why our bond is ironclad. He provides me with the perfect balance of companionship and freedom, making sure I'm never truly alone. Buster stands by my side, embodying the roles of friend, loyal companion and protector, all within his often dirty and somewhat fragrant golden Labrador self. We navigate the trail, stepping over stones and navigating steps carved into the hillside, pausing now and then for me to catch my breath and admire the view. This adventure has been in my thoughts for a while, and it feels surreal to finally embark on it. The morning air, still cool as the sun begins its ascent, and the clarity of the day enhanced by a brisk wind create perfect conditions. We're well prepared, though Buster is currently more interested in the stick he's retrieved from a ditch, intent on carrying it the entire journey, a testament to his determination, which I recall as I confront my own apprehensions about this venture. Our drive from the Lake District, lasting over half a day, subjected me to discomfort beyond what I'd braced for, marking the longest journey I'd undertaken since my life took a sudden turn years ago. Maneuvering the car, from braking to steering, sent sharp pains cascading from my neck down my arms and back. Buster, claiming the passenger seat, provided a comforting presence, especially given the challenge of the drive. Despite the considerable ache, the excitement of a weekend getaway with my dog buoyed my spirits. Yet, upon reaching the campsite and setting up our tent, the day's exertions finally took their toll, leaving me with a profound desire for rest. This was Buster's first night camping, and I wasn't sure how he'd adapt. Yet, after a curious inspection while I arranged our sleeping spots, he settled in beside me without a second thought, curled up and content. This was his true place, end of story. The following day was all about leisure walks in the woods at the base of the mountain. I needed that break to gather my energy and brace myself for the climb ahead. Sleep was scarce that night, but as we moved on, leaving the pine forest behind, my initial hesitations about the journey began to fade. The trip ahead was long, but Buster's company was more than just for the vista and the breeze. His steady presence and those deep, meaningful glances seemed to tell me, I've got your back. Standing before Snowdon, the enormity of the mountain strikes you in. A way no photograph could capture. You look up and can't help but think, that's quite a sight. The climb is challenging, more so when I learned that the path had shifted due to erosion, forcing me to take a longer route I wasn't prepared for. I found myself pausing frequently a third of the way up to ease my strained shoulders, my body tight with anxiety, worried about a misstep causing me great pain. At a point where the trail wraps around a rock face, I stopped to shake off the stiffness. Buster was right there, his gaze fixed on me as the wind played with his floppy ears. We're not quitting, I promised him. We've got this. As we ascended, the landscape shifted, with the terrain demanding more from us. Suddenly, simple steps turned into tough climbs, forcing me out of my comfort zone as I clung to tufts of grass and rocks to pull myself up. It dawned on me then, the significance of this climb. Yet, reaching a vantage point, gazing over lakes and endless horizons, it hit me how much we had accomplished, and quitting was no longer an option. Approaching the snow line, Buster was ecstatic, reveling in the snow he hadn't seen since winter. Watching him leap and dive into the snow brought a smile to my face, urging me to press on despite my own fatigue. Checking our progress, I noticed someone swiftly approaching us from below, his pace quicker than I could ever achieve, reigniting my resolve. I'm happy being alone with Buster, yet driven by the early start, the thought strikes me that we could be the first to reach the summit today. While Snowdon has seen many climbers before, at that moment I feel like an explorer, eager to beat everyone to the top. Let's push on, I tell Buster and myself. We're not far from the top, but the other hiker is gaining on us. I try to stay calm and not strain myself, aware that getting hurt here, far from help, would be disastrous. Focusing on Buster, I remind myself of how low I was when this journey began and how close we now are to a peak experience. As we approach the summit, the path broadens into a rocky plateau. The biting cold, intensified by the wind, makes me grateful for my heavy-duty hiking clothes. My eyes tear up as I spot the tall rock ahead, a 10-foot pillar of stones that also acts as a navigational aid. It signifies the very top of Snowdon. My heart races. Glancing back, I see the hiker is near, yet can't catch up now. Buster, I say with emotion, we made it. Touching. The big rock, with Buster beside me and tears in my eyes, I'm overwhelmed by what I once thought impossible. We've ascended over 1,300 meters from our campsite, taking 3.5 hours to transform utterly. Standing on that summit, I feel capable of anything. The joy, relief, and love for Buster fill me. Well done. The voice surprises me. Turning, I see the hiker who'd followed us. He smiles wide and pets Buster. Congratulations to you too, I respond, grinning. You're the second person here today, third if Buster counts. The hiker, a tourist from China, laughs and shakes my hand. After a brief chat, he wanders off to enjoy the view elsewhere on the plateau. I sit by the rock, sheltered from the wind, savouring the moment. I pull out a bowl for Buster and a thermos of water for us to share, topping off our victory with some treats. I let Buster savour the gravy snacks while I munch on a piece of malt loaf. I'd stashed a banana in an external pouch of my backpack, but it's rock hard from the cold now. I hurriedly put my gloves back on. It's far too brisk to linger on the peak for more than a short while. Yet before we head off, there's one more task I need to complete. Even as I bring the phone to my ear, tears start welling up again. After all we've endured, my feelings are always just beneath the surface. "Susie," I utter as my wife picks up. "It's me, Brandon. We've achieved it." "Achieved what?" she asks, pausing briefly before it clicks. "Ah, the ascent. We're at the summit. Snowdon, Buster and I, we've climbed the entire way." "Oh, that's wonderful," she responds with a cheerful note, and I immediately understand. Susie runs a beauty business at our house. Her polite yet warm tone indicates she's not alone. There's a client with her. On her own, she would express herself more openly. I can't help but smile, telling her I love her and promising to call back once we're at the campsite. "Yes, that would be lovely," she replies as we end the call. "Thanks a lot. See you soon." I pocket my phone, still smiling at Buster, feeling like he too gets the vibe back home. Then I slowly get up and take one last look around. With grand vistas of the untamed land below, I feel on top of the world, immensely proud to have Buster by my side. I hope he feels this sense of accomplishment too. We've both come a long way lately. "Let's head out," I say, knowing this isn't our final adventure. With Buster by me, it's merely the start. Chapter 1. Everyone has trauma. My home is up north, and that's where my heart truly lies. It's my place in the world, giving me a sense of belonging that I treasure deeply. The wild, unspoiled nature there has seen me both incredibly happy and at my lowest. It's also where I met an extraordinary dog who would change my life forever. The hilly lands and the vast lakes that mirror the sky have been the setting for the journey of Buster and myself. Yet my earliest memories trace back to a place far from England's northwest, in a quaint coastal town named Saint-Rémy along the beautiful southern coastline of France. I came into the world in Wiltshire, the youngest among 3 spry lads. Our presence there remains a mystery to me because we didn't linger long enough to establish any real ties. My father's career as a merchant seaman meant he was often away at sea. Shortly after I was born in the early 60s, he got a position overseas. Instead of staying put, my mother gathered our things for a voyage across the seas to embark on a new chapter far from home. Together, as a family, we spent 6 joyful years in a very different place. The beach is what sticks out most to me from that period. The sand was as white as sun-bleached bones, lined with beach hoots painted in soft colours, all facing a vast blue expanse of water. It was there I learned to crawl, then walk and play in the waves, always under my mother's watchful eye. At low tide, I became obsessed with exploring rock pools for crabs, shrimps, mussels, and sea snails. At times, I'd challenge my parents' patience by sneaking these new friends home in a bucket for overnight stays beneath my bed. Reflecting on those early days, it's all a blur of images, sensations, and experiences, from massive clouds gathering over the mountains to the taste of sea salt on my skin. There's no clear storyline in my mind, only the impression of a safe and content time, unaware of the changes that were looming. Our return to the UK marked the end of my father's career at sea, having spent years in both dock and open ocean. Yet, by this point, my parents were ready for a new chapter. Originating from Carlisle, a modest industrial town in the north, they decided to move back. Despite leaving a career he was passionate about, my father's extensive experience secured him a stable job fixing machines for a gymnastics equipment manufacturer. This led us to a charming house near a railway bridge, with open countryside and the silhouette of distant hills in the background. For a boy my age, the best part was its proximity to nature, just a short skip away. I grew up close to a farm and always looked forward to visiting the animals. The pigs and chickens particularly captured my heart. I would often ask my older brothers to accompany me, but they usually had other plans. It wasn't that they didn't like me, I was simply too young to fit into their world. So, whenever they went off on their own, I'd find my way to the edge of the farm to hang out with my animal pals. Being alone never bothered me. I've been quite content in my own company. This might have been the start of my solitary lifestyle, though I never thought of it that way back then. The moment that young boy passed through the farm gate, he was never alone. Conversing with the animals felt utterly natural to me. Sure, it's a kid thing, but I never outgrew it. There's a kind of magic in feeling heard by them. Connections like that are vital in life. Above all, I thrived on being outdoors. The sound of birds and the feel of the wind on my face, the freedom to roam anywhere. These were my joys. I was the kid who could turn a stick into a makeshift sword or a pile of sticks into a fort. Danger never crossed my mind. I was drawn to playing by the river, which could become treacherous with the runoff from the hills, and the old steam train tracks were another favourite spot. My father, knowing my fondness for the place, would sometimes send me to collect coal that had fallen off the trains for our fire. Indoors felt constricting compared to the great outdoors. Coming home often meant walking into a tense atmosphere between my parents. Too young to grasp their issues, I sensed the unease. Hoping to unify us, my dad one day brought home a Dalmatian we named Boxer, seemingly the default name for dogs back then. Although I never thought of Boxer as exclusively mine, he quickly became a family member. We often escaped the house together, perhaps both suffering a bit of cabin fever, for walks across the fields. It never felt like I was in control. Rather, we were companions exploring the world. Our family also adopted a cat named Beercap, but my dad never got along with old Beercap. I think the cat felt the same, always hiding when my dad was around. To my dad, the cat was just an unwanted hassle. One day, I was informed that Beercap had moved to a farm on the other side of town. As my dad explained why the cat wasn't around, I couldn't help but notice the angry scratches on his arms. Maybe my young age shielded me from understanding everything fully, from creating suspicions about those around me, and especially the truth about my parents' relationship. Chapter 2. Nothing stays the same. Leave, and don't even think about coming back. When my dad forced my mum from the house, I was rooted to the spot, watching in disbelief. They had erupted into a heated argument so suddenly that it seemed they had completely forgotten my presence in the kitchen. "Please, Dad, stop," I pleaded, but his focus was entirely on blocking the entrance, preventing Mum from entering. "Enough already." The reason for their explosive confrontation was unclear, but I found myself trapped in their battlefield. Dad was angrier than I had ever seen him, while Mum's screams and her banging on the door were so loud, I felt the urge to block my ears. "I want my kids back," she demanded. "Brandon!" Despite my efforts to pull Dad away, I was too small and felt utterly powerless. Mum even attempted to get in through the kitchen window, only for Dad to push her away. "Mum!" I yelled desperately. "I want to be with Mum." It was a confrontation that would forever linger in my memory, marking the disintegration of my parents' marriage. That day, Mum left with me, leaving my two brothers behind with Dad. There was no room for discussion or a peaceful resolution. I simply clung to Mum at the earliest chance, while Dad declared their relationship conclusively over. With our belongings hastily packed, we sought refuge with her parents in Carlisle. They held traditional views on marriage and couldn't grasp why separation was even a consideration. Yet they welcomed us. Once Mum managed to stop her tears, she reassured me of her love, promising that things would get better. At just about 8 years old, I had been exposed to events that shook my sense of security. Having spent a significant portion of my life in France, the cheerful boy I once was seemed like a distant memory. Despite being so young, making sense of the turmoil was beyond me. I was told not to worry, yet the tension constantly simmered beneath the surface. The incident that day was merely the beginning of a drawn-out, bitter divorce. As kids, we were caught in the middle of their feud. Furthermore, my brothers harboured resentment, as I was the one who ended up with Mum, making me feel responsible for abandoning them whenever we met. Life with my grandparents was challenging too. The sudden change was disorienting, and to make matters more complicated, my grandmother was suffering from dementia. I couldn't grasp what that truly meant, seeing only her trembling, distant gaze and slow, shuffling movements without any context, which frightened me. I couldn't stay indoors, wary that she might just walk in without warning. We were also far from the tranquility of the countryside. Living among buildings and streets simply didn't compare. In moments when I craved solitude, I found myself trapped. The only bright spot was my grandfather and his passion for the outdoors. He owned a plot of land nearby, his utmost pride. Having lived mostly in the background of my grandmother, it was in the garden where he truly shined, wielding a gardening tool like no other. Became an adult and left on his own. Amidst all the upset and arguments, I retreated into my own little world with Boxer and the farm animals, finding escape on countryside walks. Despite the chaos at home, there were moments that felt genuinely happy. On weekends, Dad would finish work and take us to the pub. We'd pile into his van and he'd treat us to a shandy and crisps while he was inside. It seemed like a glimpse of normal family life, even if we were mostly left to fend for ourselves. But we were oblivious to a bigger issue, our dad's problem with drinking, until one night he failed a roadside test. It occurred on a weekday trip to fix something at a hotel in the Lake District. He took my brother and me along, deciding spontaneously. A storm was looming all day, and as it got darker on the journey out, the wind intensified and rain poured heavily. From the lake road, we gazed upon water that shimmered like beaten metal. Joining our father on a task like this normally meant playing by the lake. However, by the time he parked and dashed into the hotel with his tools, the storm felt all-consuming. My brother claimed the front seat, leaving me surrounded by wiring and gadgets in the back, which was less than enjoyable. Restless and irritable, we argued over whether to crack the windows to prevent the van from fogging up. Over an hour later, Dad burst from the shadows, his coat pulled tight against the rain, and sharply told us to calm down. Whether he had been offered a drink while working or had his own supply, it was unwise for him to insert the key, start the car, and head back down the lake road. The journey back was always rough, but that night, with the windshield wipers barely keeping up, I felt like I was on a ship at sea. "Dad," I called out as we took a curve too sharply. My brother, secured by his seatbelt, could only laugh, while I, without that safety, didn't find it amusing. Dad blamed the weather for his driving and scolded my brother for his laughter. After that, I remained quiet, trying to steady myself in the back. Whenever we hit puddles, the water would slam against the underside, which Dad tried to mask with a loud song on the radio. The song's calmness strangely contrasted with the storm's chaos. Then, suddenly, as if struck by lightning, the van tipped onto two wheels and veered off the road. Amidst loud crashes and breaking glass, the van flipped onto its roof and then onto its side like a malfunctioning appliance. Once stopped, with the radio still playing and the world seemingly turned upside down, Dad quickly checked on us. Shaken but miraculously unharmed, we one by one squeezed out through the twisted metal where the windshield used to be. As I did this, I grabbed the rearview mirror that had been knocked off its mount. Dad leaned in to assist me. With my brother crying behind him, all I noticed were the marks and worry on his face. I held up the mirror, utterly taken aback, but hoping against hope that things would turn out fine. "This is going to be perfect for our go-kart," I announced. Chapter 3. Life is never easy. The crash led to my father being barred from driving. More deeply, this close call rattled our family deeply. Unfortunately, it didn't make my parents any closer. As soon as Mum found out what happened, she rushed to court, arguing that our dad wasn't capable of taking care of us. Up until that point, my middle brother and I hadn't really seen our father's drinking as a problem. At the court, Mum argued it wasn't just a one-off. From then, I started seeing my dad differently every time he picked up a beer, which was often, especially after he couldn't drive anymore. Mum had other strong reasons to want us back. Not long after the crash, Dad began dating a woman from the local shoe repair shop who soon became our stepmom. Through my mum's perspective, her entry into his life pushed us aside. We often had to make our own meals and wore dirty school clothes pinned together. Meanwhile, Mum began to shine again whenever we saw her. It wasn't long before she introduced us to the man who would become my stepdad. He was kind and made her happy, which was fine by me. As their relationship grew, they even found a place together in Carlisle. This all strengthened her argument that we would be better off with her. So, my middle brother and I moved back with our mother. Once the divorce was final and Mum remarried, it felt like she was starting a new chapter for us. For a while, it felt like a honeymoon phase. If I had been older, I might have realized it couldn't last. If my stepdad minded that he inherited kids with his new wife, he didn't keep it to himself. Soon it was apparent to my middle brother and me that this new family member saw us as a bother. Initially, he would go quiet around us, as if we were disrupting something, making us feel out of place. It wasn't too bad when Mum, who was too in love to see, was present. She worked nights at a restaurant. That's when things started to shift. Alone with us, my stepdad didn't hide his dislike. If he wasn't ignoring us or grumbling that we were in his way, he'd start cursing about our dad. It was as if he blamed him for the discomfort of having us around. Life with our mum was hard because of her boys. I couldn't be mad at my middle brother when, at 16, he quit school and decided to move out. He had snagged a job at a bed and breakfast where he could stay, which left me alone with a man who clearly hated me. "You're worthless, Jones," he'd hiss, as if my last name was some sort of insult. Then he set his rules. My stepdad would come up with them on the fly, all to control me. I wasn't allowed to turn on the lights unless he was there because it would be wasting his money. Similarly, watching TV was a privilege only he had earned. When winter came, starting a fire to stay warm was not allowed. But if my stepdad felt cold, he'd question why the fire wasn't lit and scold me until the house was warm enough for him. Life was all about his needs. If he barely tolerated me in his home, it was with a strict policy of being seen but not heard. Any sound I made, whether pulling out a chair to sit or making the stairs creak as I walked, would result in a harsh scolding. The hold he had over me grew tighter and tighter, to a point where I felt like I couldn't even breathe around him. In short, it seemed his main goal was to make me feel as unwelcome as possible. Being a boy nearing my teens, this deeply affected me. Inside the house, feeling alienated and always anxious about my stepdad lashing out, I would escape in my mind, blocking it all out. As a result, I grabbed any chance to be elsewhere. As long as I adhered to his nightly curfew, back before 8 without exception, I spent as much time outside as I could. Then, one year, my grandpa from Carlisle gave me a bike. I'm not sure if he knew what was happening at home, but I saw it as a way to escape. The Peugeot PX10, a road bike. Back then, it was considered top-notch, and I cherished the freedom it offered. Running away on foot was something I had mastered early on, but this changed the game. No matter how tough things got at home, I could jump on that bike and pedal as far as I could. Initially, lacking riding confidence, I stuck to the paths around the school field, circling it. Sometimes the caretaker would chase me, but that only made me more resolved to keep going. Anything was better than heading home before I was ready. I suspect I really annoyed him. His only respite came when I began exploring farther away, embarking on adventures that felt monumental to me, even if they were just a few miles from home. It was like having wings, a stark contrast to feeling caged. School was supposed to be my safe haven, a place where I could truly be myself, especially against the backdrop of a difficult home life. Yet if it rained, my stepfather wouldn't drive me, and would coldly pass me by without a second look as I trudged through puddles. So, it's hardly a shock that blending in at school was a challenge. At home, I was always on guard, and it was hard to drop that survival mode at school. I mostly kept to myself, maintaining a tiny circle of friends with whom finding common interests was often hard. They'd chat about TV shows they'd watched the night before, and I'd just agree, feeling the sting of exclusion. They were aware of how my stepfather treated me. Yet if I had friends over, he'd play nice, his behaviour dependent on his assessment of their intelligence. He looked down on anyone he considered bright, viewing them as fair game for his derision, given his own education ended at 11. If he found them unthreatening, he'd crack jokes, often at my expense, managing to be amusing. This confused my friends, making them question why I had issues with him. As time went on, his antagonism persisted. However, a couple of years into secondary school, my life was brightened by Leonard, a puppy my uncle gifted my mother. Leonard was a black and white terrier, injecting much-needed joy and companionship into my life. I dedicated myself to teaching him basic commands. He was a quick learner, and my first encounter with the terrier breed. With Leonard, I felt seen. Even a simple look for direction during our walks filled me with a sense of being needed. This bond not only gave my life purpose, but also instilled in me a lifelong affinity for dogs. I treasured my connection with Leonard in secret, knowing if my stepfather discovered how much the dog meant to me, he would ruin that too. I could have easily dismissed him without a second thought. Leonard, in a way, became the cornerstone of our family in that house. He never criticised or made me feel inferior. Although our mother was protective of me, she couldn't grasp the full extent of the situation. She was aware my stepfather had a tough side with me, but she was oblivious to his true nature when she wasn't looking. Living with my stepfather felt like being trapped in a cycle of loneliness and inadequacy. I couldn't bring myself to confide in Mum. She held him in high regard, despite the struggles she endured, and I couldn't fathom her reasons. Their relationship wasn't without its problems. Their arguments were fierce and poorly concealed from us. I'd sometimes eavesdrop on their fights from my room, silently pleading for her to part ways with him. On rare occasions, I heard her shout about how they'd be better off apart. All I could do was hope and wish that she'd come to my room one day and suggest we leave. Yet when she did come to see how I was, she'd notice my discomfort, asking, "What's wrong? Why don't you talk to me?" I longed to connect with Mum, but never shared my feelings with her. Instead, I learned to lock away my troubles as a coping mechanism. After all, I had already upset her once by expressing a desire to live with my brothers. I couldn't bear the thought of hurting her again by exposing the truth about my stepfather. So I'd brush off her concerns with, "I'm fine, it's nothing." Over the years, I often intended to confide in my father about my home life. I didn't feel compelled to articulate my anxieties. I viewed him as a potential saviour. He and my stepfather didn't see eye to eye, yet whenever I hinted at turmoil at home, he advised me to keep my distance. It was disheartening, especially knowing my father had his demons. His drinking problem emerged gradually after an accident. It became evident that alcohol made him unpredictable and sometimes aggressive. Staying with my father and his new wife meant living in fear of punishment for minor missteps, always alert for the threat of harsh discipline. My stepfather was harsh, and my stepmother did nothing to stop him. I often found refuge in the outdoors, spending my days exploring the woods and fields, returning home only when I knew they were away. Those times outdoors became precious memories to me. I engaged in numerous adventures, sometimes with other local kids, learning to shoot with air rifles and lighting countless campfires. It's surprising I never got hurt, but honestly, it felt safer than being at home. By the age of 16, I felt as though I was armoured for the world. Tough on the outside, but inside, I was a lonely and insecure young man, lacking confidence. I wanted to escape my stepfather and my father's drinking, but couldn't bear to leave the countryside I had grown to love. The open spaces, the mountains and valleys offered me a sense of liberation. Starting our journey from the base of Snowdon with my dog Buster, my aim was clear: reach the peak. It was a physical challenge that required putting one foot in front of the other, but also a leap of faith, trusting Buster to lead the way. Reaching the summit, I couldn't help but celebrate our achievement, reflecting on the unlikely journey that brought us here, especially since meeting Buster. The summit of Snowdon symbolizes a significant accomplishment for any hiker. A fellow hiker we met at the top seemed excited, yet unaware of the profound significance this moment held for Buster and me. After exchanging greetings and taking pictures, even calling my wife to share the moment, I started contemplating our descent. Buster seemed unfazed, but I knew the way down would test us further. Shortly into our descent, the reality hit me. Fatigue, coupled with constant pain, made every step a carefully considered effort. As Buster and I navigated our way down, I realized the challenge we still faced. Every movement needed careful thought. I have to be careful with how I step down. A slip or misstep could send a sharp pain shooting from my lower back all the way up to my neck, knocking me flat in sheer agony. Before long, weariness from the day's effort starts to catch up with me, making me teeter on the edge of blunders. Rather than staying nimble and ready to adjust to any slips, I find myself stiffening up, bracing for the worst. This makes my steps heavier, and soon enough, my neck muscles start to knot painfully. The pain spreads to my jaw, becoming unbearable. At this point, all I want is to be off this mountain, yet there's no quick way down. It's just me, my dog, and a stubborn will to press on. In places where the trail gets too steep or tricky, I have to go down on all fours or awkwardly scoot down on my rear. Buster watches me closely the whole time. He stays by my side instead of getting distracted by the wilderness. Every time I glance back at him, I'm greeted by his alert gaze and that ever-present stick in his mouth, which I've come to cherish. "I'm sorry," I tell him, knowing he could easily sprint down this mountain. "If we make it to the campsite in one piece, I'll treat you to an ice cream as soon as I can." Chapter 4. On my own. One day when I was 13, my father called me over to his place. It was rare for him to want to see me outside of our scheduled visits. Even when I was there, he seemed more interested in insulting my stepdad than talking to me. It was clear something was different this time. "I'm moving away," he announced shortly after I arrived, putting his arm around my stepmother. "We're moving to New Zealand." "Oh," was all I managed to say. "Right." I didn't feel happy or relieved that I wouldn't have to be scared of my father anymore. At that moment, I wasn't even sad about him leaving. After spending so long building walls to protect myself, his news left me feeling nothing. I just stared blankly and nodded as he talked about how life had changed since his accident. But I didn't really feel anything. "We're throwing a farewell party," he said, as though that would fix everything. "I hope you'll come." As the news settled in, I started to realize I might miss him. His anger and the threat of punishment, often accompanied by the smell of alcohol, weren't always there. When he was sober, my dad could be decent. We shared a sense of humor, and there were moments when it seemed like he genuinely cared. Speaking to me like an adult, he seemed to acknowledge that I had grown up. With his other sons out of the picture, it seemed he was trying to make amends. As he prepared for his new life, he began planning for me to be a part of it. "One day, you could join me," he suggested. "I'll have a business ready. We can work together, and everything I have will be yours when I'm gone. Every penny, son. It's all yours." Without any real plans for the future or much confidence in myself, his offer was tempting. Dad explained that now wasn't the time for me to go with him, given the custody arrangements and the distance. However, he promised that when the time was right, I could come and start anew with him. My mum saw his offer in a completely different light. She took it as an insult, undermining all the effort she put into raising me. She outright banned me from even talking about his proposal and forbade me from attending his departure celebration. That hurt a lot. Despite my fears of my dad, part of me still wanted to say goodbye. For a long time, I harbored hope that he had truly changed. Looking at my stepfather and then at my dad, I always tried to spot even the smallest signs of goodness in him. He had an undeniable charm, able to win over a room with laughter or captivating stories. I believed, perhaps naively, that he could just discard his problem with drinking. Up and started talking things through with me as I got older. My stepfather saw my growing up as a challenge to his control. His constant nagging, strict rules and threats made me feel like an unwelcome burden at home, taking up too much space and consuming too much of the food. Once I gained a bit more independence, I looked for any excuse to stay away from him, and that's when the Army Cadet Force came into my life. Joining was just something my friends were doing. The idea of spending time outdoors, handling rifles and tents, really appealed to me. I also hoped to make some new friends. What I didn't expect was how rewarding it would be. Soon I was attending not just to fit in, but because I genuinely enjoyed every part of it. Each session was a chance to be with others who also relished being outdoors. We all wore the same uniform, creating a sense of equality in a structured yet enjoyable setting where rules were respected, not dreaded. As cadets, we got to learn new skills supported by our leaders and fellow cadets. We engaged in various training exercises and shared experiences that helped me break out of my shell. For the first time ever, I felt like I had a family where I truly belonged and was accepted. This meant the world to me, especially since it was an experience I had never really had before. It even led me to consider a career in the army seriously for a while. The reason I reconsidered was the sense of purpose the cadets instilled in me always seemed to evaporate the moment I walked back into my house. My stepdad would always find a way to assert his dominance over me as soon as I walked in wearing my uniform. Maybe I was too loud, or I tracked mud in with my boots. Either way, he'd start an argument and quickly dial up the intensity. He was fond of watching wrestling on TV, enjoying the spectacle of fighters like Mickey McManus and Billy Two Rivers going head-to-head. Whether he saw a bit of himself in those wrestlers or not, he'd seize any chance to go after me. It started during a wrestling match. I was sitting next to him on the couch, trying to ignore his commentary about how he could outperform the athletes, when he suddenly shifted his focus to me. He claimed it was just play fighting, but I wasn't comfortable from the get-go. Smirking at my objections, as though I was at an age where this was somehow appropriate, he'd trap me in a hold or pin me down as though we were competitors in the ring. Gradually, what he considered fun became his way of asserting control. "Brandon, you're late," he declared once when I got back from cadets. He was in the living room, momentarily distracted from the television. I had just shut the front door. The curfew hadn't even started yet. I knew I was on time. "It's not even 8, I countered, but that was all it took for him to stand up. "Look at you," he sneered, eyeing me from head to toe. I took great pride in my cadet uniform, from my boots to my beret. It was a part of my identity that felt completely separate from life at home. "Army boy," he remarked, fixing me with a stare that seemed to signal the beginning of a conflict. Suddenly I felt incredibly isolated. My gaze flickered towards the kitchen and then upstairs, searching for any sign of my mum, but it seemed she was out, likely on a late stroll with Leonard. It was just the two of us. Realizing this, I wished I could turn around and leave, but it was already too late for that. "What are you watching?" I attempted to steer the conversation as I maneuvered towards the living room. "Hey!" He caught me by the collar of my shirt with a strong grip and twisted me around to face him. "Come on!" he roared, almost touching my nose with his. "Didn't they teach you how to fight?" I barely had a moment to explain that cadets was not about learning to brawl before he launched into me. Caught in a headlock, I shouted, "Get off! Leave me alone!" Trapped beneath his arm, waves of shock and overwhelming embarrassment washed over me. He was still larger than me, his laughter echoing as I vainly attempted to break free. My appeals for release only spurred him on to challenge me further. "Come on, Brandon. Show me what you're made of," he taunted, finding amusement in the ordeal I found utterly joyless. The night had started well with my cadet group, only to end in this low point. It dashed any hope I had of proving myself worthy of the military. Doubting my ability to stand up to my stepfather, I questioned my potential usefulness in the armed forces. Frustration and pent-up rage replaced my feelings of helplessness as I resolved to push back for the first time. I aimed to throw him against the wall, attempting to turn the tables. "Is this all you've got?" he mocked, easily maintaining control. I tried with all my might to floor him, only to find myself more securely trapped. Bent over, my headlocked position ensured as he shifted his stance to restrain me further. I made one final attempt to escape, then, fighting back the tears, I admitted defeat. At that moment, the futility of my efforts seemed to symbolize my life's struggles. No matter how hard I tried to break away, my stepfather's grip only tightened. Chapter 5. I was hopeless. At school. At 16, I decided to quit school. It just didn't make sense to me to spend my days feeling like I was constantly lagging behind everyone else. At this time, the country was facing an unemployment crisis, with figures hitting a staggering 3 million. So, leaving school didn't seem like a move that would limit me in any way. In reality, it felt like the only choice available. Despite not having much confidence in myself, I wasn't okay with doing nothing. I was determined to work, primarily to earn some money to gain some independence and distance from my stepfather. With no real plan or belief in my own skills, I made my way to the nearest job centre. The experience was bleak and soul-crushing. I stood in line, filled out paperwork, and then sat in front of a man who seemed to be preoccupied as he mechanically went over my answers. Despite this discouraging start in my job search, I managed to secure 2 interviews. The first interview was at a stable. The job involved shoveling manure mostly. I might not have been sure about my career path, but I was certain that this job wasn't right for me. The overwhelming smell and the monotony were bad enough, but the realization that I'd be living in manure the rest of my life was too much. The second interview was no less daunting. I was to meet with a local butcher in search of an apprentice. Walking away from the stable, I felt a wave of despair. Was I fit for nothing else but these kinds of jobs? I questioned myself as I checked my reflection on the shop's window. Despite looking presentable, I felt miserable. During the interview, it seemed as though the butcher was evaluating me, as though I were just another piece of meat. However, I managed to hold back my emotions and maintained eye contact while he spoke about his family's business. What caught my attention was his emphasis on animal welfare. He pointed out that they only sourced meat from places known for treating animals well. This resonated with me, even though I had the impression he might not be genuinely interested in hiring me. Once I was back home, I shared the day's experiences with my mother. She understood why manure shoveling wasn't for me. As we sipped on tea, I recounted my meeting with the butcher. "It doesn't sound so bad," she commented, even though I had been pretty down about it. Plus, we would get free meat. I wasn't entirely convinced yet, laughed, and we both ended up smiling nevertheless. I was not looking forward to my stepdad coming back home, as he always found something to nag about regarding my appearance or future plans. However, by the time he showed, I braced for her impatience, but instead she smiled kindly, asking for slices of bacon. It seemed small, but to me it was a monumental challenge. I didn't start to relax until we closed for the day. Despite the exhaustion, I felt a thrill. I had managed multiple customers, and surprisingly, I enjoyed it. Initially frightened, my anxiety eased with each pleasant exchange. The counter served as a comforting barrier, though I soon realized the barrier was more mental than physical as I continued serving. I discovered people weren't the enemy I had imagined. Not everyone was out to belittle or harm me, unlike my experiences with my stepfather or father. Customers responded to the respect I showed them, and I found satisfaction in that dynamic. That day was initially a one-time deal. But having made a positive impression, the boss suggested I try again the next day, and then the day after. In a week's time, I was balancing both behind-the-scenes duties and front-counter service. Just like when I first learned butchery, as I conquered my fears, I became eager to master every aspect of customer service. It was more than being friendly. It was about understanding and catering to the needs of the customers. This required stepping out of my comfort zone and really connecting with others, which ultimately led to my personal growth. Through my apprenticeship and into my stable job, I found myself more open to the world around me. I made friends and enjoyed spending my evenings out in Carlisle. I quickly found that my size, taller and broader than most my age, allowed me to blend in with the pub and nightclub crowds, even before I was legally allowed. It became a convenient escape from home life and from my stepfather, whom I increasingly sought to avoid. Since he couldn't enforce a curfew on me anymore, I just made sure to stay out until I was certain he'd be asleep by the time I got home. Through those years, the butcher shop where I worked became my real growing-up place. It helped me transition from a reserved boy to a confident man, although the self-assurance I built was always a bit shaky. When the shop's owner, the only butcher I worked under, decided to retire, I knew it was my cue to look for something new. I quickly landed another job, this one at a larger shop, hoping for a fresh start and new challenges. However, it didn't feel like home, and rather than sink into sadness, I opted for a warehouse job which, while temporary, paid the bills and funded my nights out. By then, I could hold my liquor and function on minimal sleep. Around this time, I also learned to drive, adding a sense of freedom I was eager for. Then came the opportunity to drive for a local bakery. The job came with benefits beyond just free pastries. The early hours suited me perfectly because they kept me away from home. With shifts starting at 3 a.m, I could finish the first round of deliveries before most people even started their day, and then enjoy a quiet house to myself in the afternoon. After a short break, it was back on the road for the second part of my shift, and still, I had time for a pint or two with friends afterward. For nearly a year, I managed to avoid the man at home who made my life difficult, never really talking about it with my mum, yet our relationship remained unaffected. It seemed my stepfather was just as pleased with the arrangement, content with my newfound independence and absence. Even then, it barely eased the strain we felt around each other on the few occasions we found ourselves together at home. One day I returned at noon to see he'd taken a break from work. He glanced up from his newspaper in the kitchen, and his face immediately soured at my sight. "Isn't there a lunch spot at your workplace?" he snapped. Our conversations had dwindled to near nothing. We managed politeness, mainly for Mum's sake, but at that moment it was just us and the family dog. Leonard, nestled in his bed, seemed to wish to remain uninvolved. "I'm just here for a short while," I informed him, moving towards the kettle. "That's relieving to hear." "Ridiculous," I muttered, back turned to him. "Pardon?" The sound of my stepdad standing up abruptly made me face him. I was met with a scowl. Leonard whimpered, curling up tighter. "Nothing," I replied, hands up. "I wasn't looking for a fight. I just wanted a quick meal and to relax after a hectic morning." "Fancy a tea?" "I wish to know what you mumbled." He took a step closer, facing me squarely. Over time, I had gotten good at diffusing these moments. He might land a hit or pin me down, but I could usually escape without much trouble. Now taller and more robust, I decided not to back down, trapped between him and the counter, feeling unjustly targeted. "Please, don't," I cautioned as he raised his hand. I caught his wrist, but he pushed me forcefully. Instinctively, I grabbed his shirt to keep my balance, and that's when the scuffle erupted. It ended as swiftly as it began, but we exchanged blows until I had him on the floor. Looking down at him, surprised and panting, I felt a rush of emotions. "Leave!" he barked. I needed no further urging. Wordlessly, angry and heartbroken, I stormed out, slamming the door. "I'm out," I told myself, feeling the countryside air cool my flushed face.